Honestly, there are 7 people I have never and will never forgive. Not just for one thing, but for a long chain of betrayals. They know exactly who they are, and so do I.
He was called the quiet Beatle, the gentle one, the spiritual one. But silence can hide a great deal. And George Harrison, the man who gave the world something, Here Comes the Sun, and the sublime guitar work threading through some of the most celebrated recordings in history, that man carried wounds that never fully healed. Most people assume that if George Harrison had a complicated relationship with anyone, it was Paul McCartney, who famously overshadowed him, or John Lennon, who could cut him down with a single dismissive glance. And those relationships were complex, no doubt. But they were also the ones Harrison understood. Bandmates. Brothers, of a kind. No. The man George Harrison truly despised, the one who provoked in him the deepest, most unresolved anger, was not a bandmate at all. He was a manager. A businessman. A man who, in Harrison's own words, helped turn what should have been the golden legacy of the world's greatest band into a legal nightmare that would drag on for nearly 3 decades. His name was Alan Klein. But to understand why, we need to begin at the beginning. Because Alan Klein did not emerge from nowhere. He stepped into a vacuum, and that vacuum had a name, too. When Brian Epstein died of an accidental drug overdose on August 27, 1967, the Beatles did not simply lose a manager. They lost the person who had held their world together. Epstein was their buffer against the music industry, their negotiator, their moral compass in business. He had believed in them before anyone else and had forged the commercial machinery that transformed 4 boys from Liverpool into a global phenomenon. George Harrison later spoke openly about the chaos that followed Epstein's death. Apple Corps, the company Epstein had built to house all of the Beatles' financial interests, quickly became ungovernable. Money was disappearing. Decisions went unmade. The organization that was supposed to protect their interests became a leaking ship. All the money that we ever made from Beatles records, from Beatle films, or any source, it all came into this company Apple, Harrison recalled, which had been pilfered by all these famous gangsters. The word gangsters was not chosen lightly. Harrison was a precise man in his language, and when he used that word, he was pointing, at least in part, at one man in particular. Alan Klein was born in Newark, New Jersey, in 1931, the son of Jewish immigrants. He was sharp with numbers, aggressive in negotiations, and utterly fearless in a room full of record label executives. By the mid-1960s, he had already made his name renegotiating contracts for Sam Cooke and the Rolling Stones, extracting far more favorable royalty deals than either act had previously enjoyed. That reputation attracted John Lennon's attention. In early 1969, with the Beatles' business affairs in crisis and Brian Epstein 2 years in the grave, Lennon became convinced that Klein was the man to fix everything. Harrison agreed. Ringo Starr followed. Only Paul McCartney, who had quietly consulted with his future father-in-law, entertainment lawyer Lee Eastman, refused. McCartney's instincts, history would show, were correct. But at the time, Harrison genuinely believed in Klein, and that belief is crucial to understanding how deep the eventual betrayal cut. Because we were all from Liverpool, we favored people who were street people, Harrison explained in a 1969 interview. Lee Eastman was more like a class-conscious type of person. As John was going with Klein, it was much easier if we went with him too. Harrison also revealed something more personal in a 1971 interview. He described Klein as the first to really take a personal interest in me. That sentence is heartbreaking in retrospect. Here was a man who had spent years feeling sidelined within his own band, perpetually overshadowed by Lennon and McCartney, allowed only 2 or 3 songs per album, rarely credited as an equal, and now someone in authority was finally paying attention to him specifically. Klein saw that. And Klein used it. For a brief moment, the Klein era seemed promising. He renegotiated the Beatles' EMI contract, securing them the highest royalties ever paid to a recording artist at the time. He stabilized Apple Corps and cut through layers of financial chaos. And when George Harrison conceived of the concert for Bangladesh in 1971, the first major celebrity benefit concert of its kind, organized in response to the humanitarian crisis following the Bangladesh Liberation War, Klein was by his side, helping to organize the event and negotiate the album release with Capitol Records. The concert itself was a landmark moment. Held at Madison Square Garden on August 1, 1971, it brought together an extraordinary lineup: Harrison, Ringo Starr, Eric Clapton, Bob Dylan, Billy Preston, Leon Russell, and Ravi Shankar, Harrison's beloved sitarist and spiritual mentor. It raised awareness for millions of displaced Bengali refugees and demonstrated that rock music could carry genuine moral weight. But the aftermath exposed exactly who Alan Klein was. Rather than arranging payment terms with the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, before the event, Klein had simply waited until afterward. The resulting confusion triggered a U.S. tax investigation into the concert's proceeds. Funds meant for starving refugees were frozen for years while lawyers argued over accounting. Harrison was devastated. This was not an act of incompetence. Harrison came to believe it was something worse, a demonstration of Klein's true priorities. The money mattered more than the mission. The deal mattered more than the people the deal was supposed to help. When Klein's management contract with Lennon, Harrison, and Starr came up for renewal, they let him go. But extricating themselves from Alan Klein was never going to be simple. What followed was one of the most cynical acts in rock music history. Harrison's first solo single, My Sweet Lord, released in 1970, was an enormous success, a #1 hit in multiple countries, a devotional song rooted in his deep spiritual commitment to Hare Krishna practice. It was also, as a U.S. court eventually determined, unconsciously similar in melody to He's So Fine, a 1963 hit by the Chiffons. The original infringement case had been filed by Bright Tunes Music Corporation, the company that owned the rights to He's So Fine. The legal proceedings were already underway when Harrison fired Klein. And then Alan Klein did something that Harrison would never forgive. Klein purchased Bright Tunes Music Corporation himself. He bought the company, suing his former client. He then used his ownership of Bright Tunes to aggressively pursue the litigation, attempting to maximize the financial penalty against Harrison. The man who had once claimed to be George Harrison's champion, the first person in the business to take a personal interest in him, had turned that intimacy into a weapon. As one legal analysis noted, the judge in the case recognized the glaring conflict of interest and limited Klein's recovery. But the legal dispute between Klein and Harrison dragged on for decades, only finally reaching resolution in 1998, 3 years before Harrison's death from cancer in November 2001. 3 years before he died, George Harrison was still fighting Alan Klein in court. The full human cost of that fact deserves a moment of stillness. Here was a man who had spent his adult life searching for spiritual peace, who had turned away from the frenzy of Beatlemania to find something deeper and more lasting, who had poured his soul into benefit concerts and devotional music and the quiet pleasures of his beloved garden at Friar Park, and yet this shadow from the late 1960s refused to lift. It would be dishonest to discuss George Harrison's grievances without acknowledging the complicated relationship with John Lennon. It was different from the Klein situation, rawer, more personal, and perhaps more painful precisely because it was rooted in something that had once been genuine. Lennon was the one who had first recognized Harrison's ability. He was the one who, in the early days, had vouched for the 15-year-old guitarist when others thought him too young. And for years, Harrison had carried something close to reverence for Lennon, a big brother figure, a creative force, someone whose approval meant something. But Lennon's shadow was also suffocating. As the Beatles grew into the most famous band in the world, Lennon became increasingly dismissive of Harrison's creative contributions. When Harrison brought new compositions to the studio, Lennon would often shrug them off. He mocked Harrison's spiritual interests, treating the sitar explorations and the growing fascination with Indian philosophy as affectations rather than genuine artistic development. The rupture manifested in a striking way in 1980. Harrison published his memoir, I, Me, Mine, a deeply personal book featuring his handwritten song lyrics alongside autobiographical reflections. When Lennon read it, he was furious. Not because of anything Harrison had written, but because of what he hadn't. I was hurt by George's book, I, Me, Mine, Lennon told journalist David Sheff in a now-famous Playboy interview. He put a book out privately on his life that, by glaring omission, says that my influence on his life is absolutely zilch and nil. In his book, which is purportedly this clarity of vision of his influence on each song he wrote, he remembers every 2-bit sax player or guitarist he met in subsequent years. I'm not in the book. Lennon added, it's a love-hate relationship, and I think George still bears resentment toward me for being a daddy who left home. I was just hurt. I was just left out as if I didn't exist. Harrison's response, delivered in a 1987 television interview with Selena Scott, was measured but pointed. He noted that Lennon was upset because Harrison hadn't credited him with helping write one line of Taxman. But Harrison had also helped write lines for Come Together and Eleanor Rigby without ever expecting a credit. The unspoken argument was consistent. The standard had never been applied equally, and Harrison had spent 20 years living with that double standard. The tragedy is that Lennon died on December 8, 1980, just months after that Playboy interview was published. The two men never had the chance to speak about it. Harrison later reflected on that silence with evident regret. He had not intended to wound Lennon by omitting him from the memoir. The book was never designed as a comprehensive autobiography. It was primarily a collection of song lyrics with personal commentary. But misunderstandings, once set, can calcify into something permanent. And in this case, the window for resolution was closed forever. If the Klein relationship was the source of Harrison's most sustained fury, and the Lennon relationship carried the most grief, then the relationship with Paul McCartney was perhaps the most exhausting, because it never quite ended. McCartney and Harrison had found each other before the Beatles existed. Two schoolboys on a bus, passing a guitar back and forth, teaching each other chord shapes. McCartney had once called Harrison his kid brother, and for a time, that affection was real. But the machinery of creative hierarchy slowly corroded it. By the time the Beatles were recording their defining albums, Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper's, the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership had become a gravitational center around which everything else orbited. Harrison's contributions were limited to 2 or 3 songs per album, regardless of their quality. Something, which Frank Sinatra later called the greatest love song of the past 50 years, was treated as a minor entry during the recording sessions, even as it ultimately became one of the most commercially successful Beatles B-sides ever released. During the Abbey Road sessions in 1969, tensions between Harrison and McCartney became openly confrontational. McCartney would regularly suggest changes to Harrison's guitar parts or compositions. Harrison, by then a mature and accomplished songwriter in his own right, resisted. In one exchange captured in early film footage from the Let It Be sessions, Harrison told McCartney directly, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play." The politeness of the phrasing barely concealed the anger underneath. In interviews after the Beatles' breakup, Harrison was candid about the creative toll. He acknowledged that McCartney was a great bass player, even a gifted musician. But he also said that Paul had, in effect, ruined him as a guitar player, by which he meant that years of having his instincts second-guessed had damaged his confidence in his own voice. Harrison also made clear, in a 1974 interview, that while he would consider working with Lennon and Starr again, he could not envision being in a band with McCartney. Not because of hatred, exactly, but because the dynamic had been established too deeply. McCartney had become the person who limited him. That role, once assigned, could not be unassigned. The strange footnote is that McCartney's instincts about Alan Klein, the instincts that Harrison had dismissed in 1969, turned out to be entirely correct. When the lawsuits and financial disasters of the Klein years finally became clear, there must have been a particular discomfort in that knowledge. Harrison had sided with Klein over McCartney. Klein had ultimately betrayed everyone. To understand why George Harrison's resentments ran so deep, it is necessary to understand what he believed music was for. From his first serious encounter with Indian classical music in the mid-1960s, an encounter brokered largely by Ravi Shankar, who became a lifelong mentor and friend, Harrison developed a conviction that music was not merely entertainment. It was, or could be, a form of spiritual practice, a way of reaching toward something beyond the ordinary noise of the world. This conviction shaped everything about how Harrison worked and what he expected from those around him. It is why he found Pete Townshend's public spiritual posturing so galling. To Harrison, speaking of peace and enlightenment while behaving otherwise was not merely hypocritical. It was a desecration of something sacred. It is also why the Alan Klein betrayal cut so much deeper than a typical business dispute. Klein had not simply cheated Harrison financially. He had involved himself in the concert for Bangladesh, an act of genuine humanitarian and spiritual intention, and had turned it into a legal disaster. He had taken the highest expression of Harrison's values and contaminated it. Harrison once described his spiritual search in terms that make this clear. In a 1974 interview, speaking about the Living in the Material World album, he said, "Everything else can wait, but the search for God cannot wait." That was not a throwaway line. For Harrison, It was the organizing principle of his life. When Alan Klein made that principle look foolish, or worse, exploitable, Harrison's response was not just anger. It was something closer to a wound that never fully closed. The irony of George Harrison's life is that the man most associated with spiritual equanimity was also a man who carried long-burning grievances. Those two things are not contradictory. Spirituality is not the absence of feeling. It is a way of working through feeling, of not being destroyed by it. By the late 1980s and 1990s, Harrison had found a kind of equilibrium. The Traveling Wilburys, the supergroup he formed with Bob Dylan, Roy Orbison, Tom Petty, and Jeff Lynne, brought him genuine joy and a creative freedom he had rarely experienced within the Beatles. Cloud 9, his 1987 album, produced the surprise hit, Got My Mind Set on You, and reintroduced him to a new generation of listeners. He immersed himself in his garden at Friar Park, his Victorian Gothic estate in Henley-on-Thames, which he had purchased in 1970 and spent years restoring to beauty. Gardening, for Harrison, was a direct extension of his spiritual practice, an act of patience, of working with nature rather than against it. He also began, slowly and incompletely, to process the older wounds. In a 1992 interview, speaking about the Beatles' years, he acknowledged that there had been a strange bond between him and McCartney, something unspoken that persisted despite everything. He even admitted that McCartney was among the finest bass players he had ever heard. But forgiveness, where it existed, was never confused with amnesia. The Alan Klein matter was settled in 1998 in the courts, but there is no record of Harrison ever expressing anything resembling warmth toward the man. Klein died in 2009, 8 years after Harrison. Whether Harrison ever made peace with what Klein had done, in whatever private, internal reckoning he allowed himself in the final years of his life, is something only Harrison knew. In May 2001, George Harrison's cancer, which had first appeared in 1997, returned and spread. There was surgery, then the discovery that the cancer had reached his brain. He traveled to the United States for treatment, spending time at a clinic in Staten Island and eventually at the UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles. He died on November 29, 2001, at the age of 58, at a friend's home in Los Angeles, with his wife Olivia and his son Donnie beside him. Friends reported that in his final months, Harrison maintained the equanimity that had always defined the best version of himself. He was focused on his family, on his spiritual practice, on leaving things in order. His last composition was a song titled Horse to the Water, recorded with Jools Holland not long before his death. He was 58 years old. He had written something at 26. He had organized the concert for Bangladesh at 28. He had walked away from the most famous band in the world because he needed room to breathe, and had spent the remaining decades of his life building a musical and spiritual legacy entirely on his own terms. The grievances were real. The betrayals were real. Alan Klein had stolen years from him, years that should have been spent on music and gardens and devotion, not on lawyers and courts. John Lennon had died before the silence between them could be broken. Paul McCartney had remained a figure of complicated, unresolved feeling. But against all of that, Harrison had also produced one of the most quietly extraordinary solo catalogs in rock history. All Things Must Pass. Living in the Material World. Somewhere in England. Cloud 9. Albums that bore no resemblance to the Beatle he had been, albums that could only have been made by someone who had fought, hard and long, for the right to be himself. The story of George Harrison is not really a story about resentment. It is a story about what happens when a deeply private man, a man of genuine spiritual seriousness, of real artistic depth, finds himself surrounded by forces that want to use him, diminish him, or simply ignore him. He survived all of it. And the most striking thing about George Harrison, when you look at the full arc of his life, is not that he hated Alan Klein, or that his relationships with Lennon and McCartney were more fractured than the public knew. The most striking thing is that through all of it, he kept making music that mattered. He kept searching for something true. The Beatles were four guys who loved each other very much, he once said. And that's all there is to say about it. Maybe so. But the love, in his case, was always complicated by the knowledge of what had been taken, not only by those he had trusted most, but by a man who had seen his vulnerability and chosen, very deliberately, to exploit it. George Harrison never forgave Alan Klein. He had excellent reasons not to. And perhaps that refusal to forgive was, in its own way, a form of honesty, The same uncompromising honesty that ran through every song he ever wrote, every time he chose truth over comfort, every time he refused to pretend that things were simpler than they were.